Loading screens are dying. Now you might be tempted to ask, who cares? Waiting is universally hated. I want to play my video game and I want to play it now. We live in a culture that seems motivated to remove any still moments, desperate to distract you, lest you have a thought. This is clear due to the massive popularity of short-form content and the degradation of the public at large's already minuscule attention span. I can order a package and have it arrive in less than a day. If a TikTok doesn't catch my attention in less than 5 seconds, it is immediately discarded. Movies are now being written with the assumption the viewer is doing something else at the same time. We live in a fast-paced world and time has become increasingly valuable, so we look for any way we can to eliminate wasted productivity. And this worldview has seeped its way into all aspects of our life, including video games. For example, during the marketing of Spider-Man 2 for the PS5, one specific feature being highlighted were the lightning-fast loading times.
Unlocks our brand new fast travel system. As you can see here, the PlayStation 5 and its SSD means you can move across the city with very little downtime.
You could instantly fast travel from one end of the map to the other. When I played the game for myself, I found it worked exactly as advertised. I was able to seamlessly travel several in-game miles in a matter of seconds, if even that. What previously required a loading screen now only required a minor camera transition and a cool animation. At first, this seems great. I mean, this effectively gives me more time to play the game, so how could I possibly complain? Well, somehow, I found a way. And while the extinction of loading screens may be a valuable technical achievement, we actually end up losing so much more than we ever stood to gain. But before I get into that, why do video games need to load in the first place? Well, when you first download a video game, its assets like the code, models, animations, sounds, and textures are all stored on a storage device, such as a hard drive, a game cartridge, or a disc. While these devices are great at holding and storing data, they are not made to transfer the data to your system's GPU and CPU, which are required to run the game's code and render the game's graphics. However, transferring data is technically a physical process and is limited by your system's hardware, as in its physical components. Data must travel from the storage device through controllers and system buses into the computer's memory, also known as RAM, or random access memory, and then to the GPU's own memory before it can be used. Each of these pathways has a maximum bandwidth, meaning only a limited amount of data can be moved at once, and a latency, meaning there is also a delay before the data even begins to arrive. Data is also usually compressed on a disk and must be decompressed, organized, or verified by the CPU as it's being transferred. Loading takes place when you initially boot the game and is technically a constant process even while playing the game. However, when data being used changes drastically, such as when fast traveling, entering a new area, or dying and resetting an area, significant amounts of data must be loaded at once. That data can't all be held and accessed instantly in RAM, so the game has to pause and load it. This entire process takes time. How much depends on the complexity of the game's data and the efficiency of your hardware. So, how exactly are these instant load times achieved then? Although it's much more complicated than I'm able to explain, it essentially boils down to better storage devices that transfer the data more efficiently, combined with optimization of how the data is transferred so that it can avoid certain data bottlenecks. Another way to think of it is like a library. The library itself is like the storage device, holding hundreds of thousands of books which represent the game's data. To read a book or play the game, a librarian must bring a book to you, which represents the CPU or GPU using the data. How many books you can read at once depends on the size of your desk, or your RAM. Loading is faster when the librarian can carry more books at once, meaning a higher bandwidth. The librarian moves faster, such as having a faster storage device, or by creating an efficient system for finding and delivering the books, as in having an optimized memory or management system. But this process has only recently become nearly instantaneous. For years, loading your video game could take anywhere from several seconds to several minutes. While this may not seem like a long time, many games have to load every time you move from one scene to the other, or every time you die. In games where that happens frequently, loading presents an obstacle to keeping the player entertained. After all, a blank screen while the game is getting ready is boring, immersion breaking, and may even lead to players dropping the game altogether. And herein comes the humble loading screen. Developers figured out you could use a small, nearly inconsequential amount of data to display a loading screen, while the larger, more complex data was prepared. A simple, yet genius solution to a troublesome quirk of video games. But with the loading screen comes possibility, and endless opportunities for creativity. And although they were restricted in the amount of data able to be used in their loading screens, I find that creativity frequently blossoms when placed under mitigating circumstances. Interestingly, the first video games did not actually have loading screens, because they did not need to load. For example, Pong, released in 1972 for the Atari, had no loading screen because it was built using analog circuitry and didn't use data the way modern video games do. However, later in 1976, the Fairchild Channel F console was released, which did use microprocessors as well as ROM cartridges, meaning you could play multiple games on one system by swapping out their video carts. When you inserted a video cart and turned the console on, the screen would quickly load the game. While this loading screen isn't necessarily designed and rather just the natural view of what the screen looked like while the game booted up, I do consider this to technically be the first loading screen for a video game. However, a true loading screen must have some thought and design put into it, rather than just being a natural byproduct of a computer process. But pinning down the actual first game to have a loading screen is quite difficult. But if we go by those rules instead, some of the first loading screens were actually on the DECO cassette system arcade machines released in 1980. The owner of the arcade machine could switch out cassette tapes, and when the cabinet was turned on, the data from the tape would have to be copied to the arcade's machine RAM chips. While this was happening, a screen with the countdown timer was shown to indicate how much longer it would take, essentially being one of the first loading screens with thought put into its design. From these humble beginnings, loading screens would begin to expand beyond their more functional and administrative purposes, and instead begin to appeal to the player's want for entertainment. The first and most obvious method of increasing the entertainment value of a loading screen was to insert images, 3D models, or animations. Interestingly enough, this type of loading screen is still widely used in games today like GTA and even Fortnite. A still image essentially provides the same value as a painting. It's something interesting to look at and in theme with the content you are taking a short break from actively engaging in. And although your attention during a loading screen image is likely more passive than active, it helps you to more easily keep your mind focused on the game and allows you to retain a certain level of immersion. Taking this idea a step further, we have loading animations. An animated icon, usually in conjunction with the still image, can create a slightly more interesting visage. And taking the idea of animation further, some games cleverly have preloaded cutscenes that play while a new scene is being loaded, which essentially allows the player to constantly engage with the game's content in some form. A lot of games use this technique, but my favorite version of this probably has to be the short cutscenes that play in the Batman Arkham games after you die, which show a villain mocking the camera or one of your allies mourning your failure.
They destroyed my plant, Batman. I can't stop them now.
These loading clips stay in theme with the game and interestingly actually serve to deepen immersion rather than just maintaining it. The Batman Arkham games are primarily in third person, meaning you play with the camera situated so that Batman himself can always be seen. But during these loading screen clips, you are presumably seeing things in first person, meaning you are seeing things through Batman's eyes. And while the characters talking to the camera are talking to Batman, they are really talking to you as the player. This also only occurs after you die, meaning some level of immersion has already been broken, with you the player failing, as Batman himself would never fail and canonically shouldn't at this specific point in the narrative. So with death in a video game, some level of immersion is always lost. But by having the characters of the game break the fourth wall by talking to you or perhaps the version of you that is Batman, it reveals a sort of pseudo-meta narrative that allows you to keep and even strengthen your level of immersion. But not every video game needs or even wants to keep you immersed in such a way. Some loading screens lean into the idea that you are in fact playing a video game and that you are not actually literally Batman. Many loading screens will show you your statistics or information about your progression. For example, in Breath of the Wild, the loading screen shows you how much money you have, how many shrines you've completed, how many collectibles you've found, and what major story beats you've accomplished. Beyond providing information, these kinds of loading screens also offer you a sense of pride, giving you a look back at all you've done and what you have to show for it. So instead of hyper-immersion, it offers you a chance to reflect on the experience of the video game and level of progression towards your overall goals within the game. It's also important to think about when loading screens are most likely to occur. Unless you're God's ultimate gamer, you can probably guess what I'm about to say. Loading screens frequently occur after you've died or failed in some way. And here we have the loading screen's tips and hints. Many loading screens take this opportunity to give you an obvious or extremely unhelpful tip. Have you tried dodging? Or make sure to reduce the enemy's health while keeping yours above 0. And worst of all, lowering the difficulty setting can make the game easier. All I can do is swallow my pride, shake my fist, and try again. I think this is probably when loading screens are at their worst. Occasionally, a loading screen tip can actually offer helpful information when it comes to solving a confusing puzzle, but I find this type of success to be indicative of a larger failure in the design of the game. It acts as a sort of band-aid, as the design of the puzzle was not intuitive enough for players to figure out on their own, or it prematurely takes away the chance for the player to actually solve it independently. The same is true when tips and hints tell you of specific mechanics and when they can be used within the game. Using a loading screen to give the player this type of information functionally makes sense, but I find it to be lazy in terms of game design and suggests the game's mechanics aren't thoughtful enough to encourage use of the mechanics naturally through gameplay. There are tons of other ways loading screens try to keep players entertained. Beyond tips and hints, many loading screens offer lore about the game, fun facts, or even music tracks to keep you engaged. But the fundamental problem with the loading screen is that it takes you away from what you want to be doing, which is playing the game. So what better way to fix this problem than by letting the player play a game while they wait to play their game? I now present the playable loading screen. The first example of such a loading screen was in Skyline Attack on the Commodore 64, released in 1984. While waiting for the main game to load, you were able to play a simple version of Snake. Surely this is the perfect type of loading screen, you might be thinking. And maybe you're right. So why didn't more games do this? Well, in 1998, Namco filed a patent on this type of feature, meaning nobody but Namco would be allowed to have a playable minigame during their loading screen. That is, unless they paid Namco a small fortune. But if you're an astute observationist, you might have noticed many games released after that point in time did have playable loading screens. For example, Assassin's Creed, which let you run around at the Nexus while the game loaded, or FIFA, which let you hit practice shots. This is because Namco's patent only applied to auxiliary minigames, meaning games not part of the main game. So if the playable loading screen was part of the main game, the patent did not apply. And I find this generally worked to enhance games that did want some sort of playable loading screen. A loading screen being part of the actual game makes a lot more sense than some sort of unrelated minigame that could break up the flow of your play. However, the patent did expire in 2015. So, have any games capitalized on the expired patent? Nothing really notable, and there are two main reasons for this. First is that many loading screens aren't necessarily even long enough to justify coding an entire minigame into them. Additionally, as I mentioned, most players probably wouldn't even want to intermittently play an unrelated minigame while playing the game they actually decided to play and become immersed in. I honestly don't think we'll ever see a major comeback of the auxiliary minigame during loading screens, and that's probably for good reason. Loading screens are, and always have been, a fundamental part of video game design, a technical facet that limits, but also presents space for opportunity. It's fascinating to see how different games have interpreted the liminal space that loading screens exist in, a place between play and pause. But video games are built primarily to entertain. True, many have artistic value, and I can't say that I haven't had my soul fundamentally affected by games that I consider to be great works of art. But nonetheless, the vast majority of video games are product first and art second. The very existence of the loading screen is a harsh reminder of that reality. It reminds you this world was built and requires machinery to run. Machinery capable of replicating physics and rendering awe-inspiring scenes, but machinery still. The loading screen represents that crack in your perspective, allowing the real world to seep through, coming with it all its problems, strife, and stress. The engineers of these false worlds have designed the loading screen to seal these fissures and maintain your enthrallment. But maybe that's the wrong way to look at it. A loading screen does tear you from your immersion, yes, but perhaps we should think of it as a bridge rather than a break. A channel connecting the ideals of the video game to the experience of the real world. A moment to reflect, a time to learn, and a respite from your amusement. Music is made up of silent moments, just as much as it's made up of notes. Loading screens exist as those pauses, allowing the rest of the experience to breathe and supplant itself into your psyche. When I rotated 3D models in Skyrim, watched Batman's villains berate him, or read through the hints in Breath of the Wild, I did find myself technically disconnected from the game world, but I found that in these moments of pause, my mind could connect both to the experience of the game and my own personal lived experience. During these loading screens, you aren't bound to gameplay, but free to reflect and interpret. In such a boundary is where the game can become as deep as you want it to be. So yes, loading screens do create a natural space between player and game, but it is in that space where true reflection and interrelation can occur. To be honest, earlier when I said loading screens are dying, may have been a slight overreaction. In fact, you probably might have even played a new game that did have a loading screen time of 30 seconds or even longer. It is true that the technology is improving, but not everyone has access to the newest hardware. Games are also getting bigger and more complex in accordance to its hardware's functionality. Not every game is built to be optimized for lightning-fast loading times. Online games that have to search for matches and players across the internet will probably always have some sort of loading times. But we are nearing the point where loading times are whittling away, and loading screens will only become more and more antiquated and unnecessary. Perhaps even after all this, you still don't think we've lost much, and that's a fair perspective to have. But it is worth pointing out how loading screens, which exist as a natural flaw of hardware, have become a liminal space where deeper reflection can occur and artistic intent can shine. So ask yourself, as loading screens fade away into obscurity, what else might we lose?